in this next page, the first thing we're going to talk about here is the 100 Years' War, which is a battle fought in the 14th and 15th centuries. 14th to 15th centuries, and is fought between France and England. So as we kind of hinted at, or not hinted at, I think we just talked about it on the last page, England has territories in what we consider to be modern-day France, right? So modern-day France, the territory, especially around Normandy and the coast, England had a lot of control over because, of course, the first English king was, from France, right? So we see this battle over the kind of mainland area of England. England originally starts winning, and it's a series of wars. It's not one war. They just call it the 100 Years' War. So England kind of starts the war off pretty well because of the use of longbows, these massive bows with huge range that were just able to kind of demolish the French, right? But over time, what we see is that France will eventually win the war, taking almost all English land on the mainland, except for the port of Calais, which, if you play the game Europa Universalis 4, you kind of jump right into the middle of this pretty much, right? But there are the thing we really want to talk about here are two key results of this war. One of them is we see kind of the notion of dialect, right, of language informing kind of an idea of a nation, right? Notion of dialect creating forming like an early sense of nation, right? Or nationalism, right? The idea of love of nation, right? You're English or you're French, right? So that's one of the key things, right? Is this development within France and England. The second part is the use of gunpowder weapons, right? We start to see gunpowder weapons be kind of introduced pretty late on into this war. Another thing I actually do want to mention that the book didn't mention is the increasing power of the monarch here, especially with the use of professional armies, especially by the French, right? This meant that they were less dedicated to the nobles and instead could kind of do it themselves, right? And the other thing that came along with professional armies is the taxation by the national governments of both France and England against their people to provide more funds to fight the war. Okay. So a couple other things here is that we see the Normans not only conquer England, but they also go all the way down into the Mediterranean, and they conquer Sicily from the Muslims that were in Sicily, right? And then we also start to see the Reconquista in Spain, right? And the Reconquista is, of course, the attempt to reconquer the Spanish, so the Iberia. Let's not say Spain. What am I saying? Iberia, which is Spain and Portugal, from Muslims. Okay. One thing I do also want to mention here that the book did not is what's going on in Italy. Just very briefly, we have a kind of series of setups in Italy. Starting in northern Italy, we have a series of city-states that are kind of provisionally part of the Holy Roman Empire. Places like Venice, Milan, and those kind of places. So that's in northern Italy. In central Italy, we have an area called the Papal State, which was given to the Pope by the father of Charlemagne, Pepin the Short. We're seeing that in central Italy. And then in southern Italy, we're going to see the Byzantines have control in southern Italy, which eventually will be conquered by our favorite conquerors, the Normans. All right. Okay. So now that we're kind of done with the political organization of Western Europe, let's talk about religion in Europe. And as we talked about before, right, in the year 1054, right, we had the Great Schism, which created the first two sects of Christianity, the Roman Catholic Church in Western Europe, and the Eastern Orthodox Church in Eastern Europe, which led to a big cultural split between the two areas as well, right? The key thing for religion in Western Europe at this point, right, is that in place of a large political state, with no large political state in Western Europe that unified them politically, what we see is the church kind of takes the place of that, right, and becomes this kind of unifier of Western Europe in ways, at least as much as it is unified. We see this kind of very similar almost to Hinduism in India, right, before Islam, of course, makes its way in. But Hinduism in India was able to really unify people due to its reliance on the caste system, right? It was able to kind of create this social and cultural uniformity and unification that states simply were not able to replicate, right? So typically what we see is that people of the church are typically the most intelligent people within their societies, right? They're the only ones who are really educated. And on top of that, we see manors all have small churches, right? Every single feudal structure feudal institution in Western Europe at this point has a church, right? Which is a big deal, right? And so it creates a sense of unified identity despite the increasing change in how people talk, right? In terms of not having the same, language, right? And so one of the kind of crucial things, they build the first universities in Western Europe, right? Which is it's going to be a huge institution for the growing intelligence and technology of Western Europe, right? And so on top of that, we also see art focus on religion, right, on Christianity, right, and of course, because the church builds the first universities, you also see that the kind of early intellectual leaders of Western Europe are all religious leaders, right? They held massive power over feudal lords, right? If a feudal lord upset the Pope or a local lord, right, they could kind of withhold services, right, which would make the serfs very upset with the lord and stuff like that, right? On top of that, we have the church has its own hierarchy, right? Right, has almost its own social political structure. Hierarchy of the church, right? At the very tippy top, of course, we have the Pope, followed by the bishops, which basically control states of the church, right? So they're not necessarily aligned to the states that they had, but basically they control different regions of the church, right? And then below those bishops, we had the local priests who administer directly to the common people, right? Almost like the ground troops in a way, right? Another thing about Christianity during this time period, and let's just let's create a title here. I forgot to create a title. Catholicism in Western Europe. Okay. And then on top of this, we also have monastic orders, right? Monasteries, which I'm going to actually create a key term here for. Monasticism in Western Europe, right? And so we saw that these kind of monasteries function very similarly to manors, right? Where you had people kind of work the lands of the monasteries, right? The monasteries would have their own farmland and stuff like that. And so not only the monks of the monasteries, but also local peasants would work for the monastery, right? So we also do see women able to kind of function in monastic life as nuns, right? Where we had nunneries, right? So women could also have their own monastic orders as well. And so we see these monasteries are also very important because they're also usually kind of one of the bigger sources of wealth in Western Europe, right? We do see over time, we start to see the wealth of the church become a problem, especially because you see, especially in these monasteries, it becomes a big issue because these monasteries become quite wealthy, but at the same time, one of the key things for monks and nuns is that they have vows of poverty, right? So they're not allowed to be wealthy, right? And so, but they're becoming wealthy, and so that creates a lot of questions within society, right, about the role of these monasteries. And we'll talk about this more later on, but this will, of course, lead into the Protestant Reformations, right? All right, so let's talk about probably the biggest event for Western Europe during this time period, especially very right at the beginning of this time period, and that is, of course, got to be the Crusades. Right, the Crusades are super important for European history, not necessarily because of what they actually did, but because of the impacts of it. Right. So the key goal of the Crusades was to regain control of the Holy Land, which is specifically the city of. Let me just redo all that. Jerusalem, right? They want to regain the region of Jerusalem, which of course is Palestine, right? Because that is the one, the holy site of Christianity, right? And currently, it was in control by the Muslim Abbasid Caliphate, right? And so, but even with the Muslim control, right, we've talked about the Muslim societies as being pretty open to other religions. And so, especially Christians, and Christians had full ability to go to the Holy Land, but that wasn't enough, right? And so, what we see here is that the Crusades are a way for the Pope to kind of increase political power over the local lords and kings in Europe, right? If they can basically create this whole army out of nothing almost, and have that army do its bidding, right? That shows the power of the church, right? But the other thing that's going on here is the rule in Western Europe known as primogeniture. So primogeniture is a system where the eldest son receives in the inheritance of the father, right? And so when you have these nobles who die, only the eldest son gets their land, right? And what that leads to is kind of a idle and frankly angry group of lesser nobles, right? The younger sons of nobles, right? And they're not really doing anything. They usually become knights and they maybe get some land, but they're not really getting out. They're not really getting a whole lot, especially compared to their elder sons, right? And so this was a way to the Crusades. The Crusades would kind of distract these nobles, right? Would distract the younger lords to prevent them from kind of causing chaos. And also distract the unemployed peasants, right, who did not have jobs. And so they would, a lot of times that would naturally lead to tensions, right? And so they would typically kind of pillage lands and stuff to get food and whatnot. Another reason for the Crusades is that the kind of growing power of merchants, right? The merchants desire access to new trade routes. And so by conquering the Middle East, or at least the Holy Land, they believe they could get better access to trade routes, right? So these all lead to the Crusades, which lasts from the 11th through the 13th century. There are a lot of Crusades, but there's only a few to really focus on, right? But yeah, we also see kind of as we talked about, right? It's a lot of it's due to political tensions between popes and kings, right? And then we also see the Eastern Orthodox Church also kind of helps sponsor, supports the Crusades as well, because they are seeing Muslim invaders into the regions that they have right now, right? And that's actually kind of a lot where the beginning ideas for this occur, right? And it starts with Pope Urban II. And so let's actually talk about the Crusades. Only one is really successful, and that's the First Crusade. They successfully take the Holy Land. Right, so they successfully take the Holy Land in the First Crusade. However, a Muslim leader by the name of Saladin reconquers it, I believe, less than a century later. Right, so they don't have control over it for too long. Yeah, a little bit less than a century later. Right. And then the other one to talk about is the Fourth Crusade, which is a crusade gone horribly wrong, where Venetian merchants fund it. So the Venetian merchants being merchants of Venice, fund the crusade. And kind of as payment for the crusade, they have they tell the soldiers to sack the city of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, who is theoretically their ally in this, right? In this Fourth Crusade, they're successful in sacking Constantinople, and it kind of really leads to the decline of the Byzantines pretty significantly, right? It's kind of the beginning of the end for the Byzantine Empire, right? So one of the key kind of, after the extra effect that's super crucial here, is the promotion of the increase in cultural and technological exchange between the Muslim world and Christian world. Right, even though they're at war, right, you're seeing merchants come in and realize they can make a profit here, and so they do so. And this is going to lead to a lot of technological and social change going forth in Europe. Right. So on top of this, as we're kind of seeing, is that the Europe is going through a lot of changes at this point, right? We're seeing the around the time of the Crusades, right? We're seeing economic growth, right, in local areas, right, is occurring due to some of the agricultural stuff we talked about in the last page, right? And so because of that, we're seeing an increase in trade as well. And kind of one of the main people to help give that increase in trade is, of course, the traveler, the merchant, Marco Polo, who may or may not have lied on almost everything he did, about everything he did, which I'm sure most of it's, a good chunk of it's true, right? But he travels to the court of Kublai Khan, travels to the Yuan dynasty and the court of Kublai Khan. Right. And so that is a big deal. That really increases interest in China for Europeans. Right. And so as we start to see this increase in trade, right, this increase in trade also brings about a change in social structure. Mostly because of the change in economic power within society, right? So what we're seeing here is the growth of a middle class of merchants, right? And specifically kind of those urban elites, right? We would probably want to call them. And they gave them a few names, right? The bourgeoisie, or the burghers, right, are the names for these kind of middle-class merchants, right? And so they also talked about kind of merchants, shopkeepers, craftspeople, small landlords, right? And so, of course, with an increase in trade and an increase in agricultural growth also comes an increase in urbanization. Right, we see an increase in urbanization as well, which comes along with the population growth. Right, and so we see that this leads to again kind of this shift back into here as well. What we also see around this time, though, is the Black Plague, the Black Death, as this called it, right? The Black Death leads to a massive decrease in population during this time period. But the other thing that happens here is that this increases the power of the peasants that survived, because now all of a sudden there is less less supply of laborers, right? And so because of that, the laborers that remained had a lot more power, right, against their overlords, right? So at the same time as the plague creates some unrest as well, we also have the Little Ice Age hit, right, which will decrease agricultural production, decrease farming production. So even though we did say, yes, hey, farming is growing up at the around 1200, right, we see that kind of turn around, right, well, that's or at least decrease a little bit. And so these two things really create a lot of social unrest, a lot of riots, right? A lot of infighting within urban areas, within manors, right? All these different things, right? And so another thing that happens here with these kind of issues is that we see a scapegoat emerge. The Jewish population within Western Europe, right? Which there were quite a lot there. But the issue that happens is that the Jews are in charge of banks, in charge of banks and kind of money lending, because Christians could not charge interest. And so the Jews were kind of the only people left that could do that. Right. And so when the economy declines, right, when the economy decreases, we see Jews blamed and persecuted for it. Right, kind of blaming them as the issue, right, and that leads to a growth in what is called anti-Semitism. Right, and so they get expelled from most of Western Europe and migrate over to Eastern Europe, where for right now it's good, but later on we will see that's not the case. Okay. So much like the Jews in Western Europe, the Muslims also faced a lot of persecution and discrimination. Right. We talked about the Reconquista in Spain. Right. We also see some issues in other places like Sicily. And so because of these kind of things, we see Muslims move out of Western Europe and move specifically into Southeastern Europe, around the area of the Byzantine Empire, and eventually will be the Ottoman Empire, who will start to expand in this region. Okay. The thing here, though, is that we see both of these societies, both Jews and Muslims, really, even though they're being persecuted, they really, really helped society grow in Europe, right? Muslim trade exchange especially really helped grow European society. Okay. So the thing here, the The other thing we want to talk about here is the role of women, which, spoiler warning, and you've probably already gotten this idea, but it's not very good, right? We see an increasing patriarchal society as we see an increase in wealth and urbanization. With increase in wealth and urbanization. Okay. So we see a lack of education. We see a lack of economic power as well, right? So no real rights for women in this society. They're just at the behest of the men in their life. The one place where women do have a role is in the monastic orders, right? Women can go join a monastery and kind of gain a lot more independence and freedom over themselves there. We do have some women have become artisans or work in guilds in urban areas, but those are more exceptions to the rule than actual rules, right? Okay, so two more things we got to talk about here. Man, I'm running out of space. Okay. But the thing I want to talk about here is the Renaissance. So the Renaissance is the rebirth of Greek and Roman culture in Europe, right? The interest in these cultures, right? And so one of the key technologies here that helps spread the Renaissance is the printing press of Johannes Gutenberg. Johannes Gutenberg, which helps spread literacy within Europe, especially amongst the middle class merchant class, right? The movable type printing press, which is different from the kind of block printing press that we saw in China. So movable type is each letter or each word will have its own particular block, and then you can maneuver those blocks around to create an infinite amount of pages, right? One of the main characteristics of the Renaissance is humanism. Right. So what is humanism, right? Well, instead of focusing on God, right, what humanism says is actually individuals as their own entity, right? Instead of saying you are here because of God, it says no, actually as a human you matter, right? And what happens in your life matters, right? And so they actually kind of begin the move away from God and Christianity in Europe, right? They're kind of one of the first little pushes away. And stuff like that. Okay. And also start to write in secular languages. Right? They start to write in secular languages, which are non-religious languages. So the religious language of the church is Latin. And so because of that, right, we see a kind of increase in the power of kings. Of monarchies away from the church as people start to be more focused on their language rather than their relationship with God. Okay, there are two Renaissances. We have the Southern Renaissance, which is where it starts in Italy. All right, so the Southern Renaissance, which really grows up out of the Italian city-states, right? So they talked about Dante. I'm not going to focus too much on that. But that is the first, this is the first Renaissance, and it's supported by the church originally. They kind of get it started. The Renaissance kind of starts with the construction of different churches or church doors and stuff like that. But over time, we start to see wealthy merchants patronize the Renaissance, especially the Medici family of Florence. Okay. And then we have the Northern Renaissance, which is a lot more secular than the Southern. It's a lot less focus on religion, right? And so this spreads to places like England and the Netherlands and Germany. They talked about the Canterbury Tales, created by Geoffrey Chaucer, which is in vernacular language, right? Kind of the first, I believe it's the first English book, right? And it's a series of satires, right? And so the Northern Renaissance, just, yeah. So those are our two Renaissances. Last thing we need to talk about is the Key Haven Ruse. The Key Haven Ruse. So the Key Haven Ruse was created by Viking merchants, right? So Viking traders going to Constantinople, or trading in Constantinople, helped create the Key Haven Ruse, right? Which is located in Kiev, Ukraine, right? They established these trading posts at the Key Haven Ruse. So they established the Key Haven Ruse as kind of a trading post for them to kind of replenish supplies or do what they need to do to kind of get themselves to Constantinople. They adopt Eastern Orthodox, which increases their relations with the Byzantines. And the Byzantines are going to be a massive influence upon the Key Haven Ruse and Russian society, right? But what we're going to see here in the 13th century, they're going to be the one part of Europe that is conquered by the Mongols, which really kind of sets them away from the rest of society, from the European society, right? And so the Mongols only wanted, they're basically a tribute state, so they had local nobles collect taxes. And these local nobles gain a lot of power from this power given to them by the Mongols. And so they begin to resist Mongol rule and help establish the kind of modern day, and in particular, this one man, Ivan the Great, helps establish the modern day Russia, right? Or begins establishing Russia. It really is Muscovy, but he kind of is the beginning of Russia. Whew, that was a lot. All right, so that is pretty much the end of the unit. I'm going to do one last kind of topic review for 1.7, but that is the last of this set, and then we'll start on topic 2. Thank you guys so much, and I will see you in the next one.